That was a hell of an introduction. Thank you very much. As I said the other day, it's downhill from here. You've done it for me. So I'll just say, have a nice drink and I'll see you a bit later. So thanks for asking me. I'm very jealous of you being in what looks like a nice sunny Guernsey. I'm stuck in a rather dull looking north of England at the moment. I'm even more jealous that I gather you're in a brewery, which isn't right. I haven't even got a drink here. I'm going to have to correct that after I finish speaking to you. Anyway, I will get on. I've been asked just to talk to you for not too long. I'll be pleased to hear just a little bit about the scene in the UK as has developed over the last a very recent time, 2 or 3 years. It seems like a lifetime sometimes, but really recent past. A little bit about what I think we've got right in the UK and what we also, more particularly in a sense, got wrong in the UK. And then I'll pass over to my friend and colleague, Hannah, who has been with me on this journey for the last few years as well. So very briefly, me, I'm a neurologist by background. I'm not anymore. I think I'm just a cannabis physician now, which is a slightly odd end to a career, but that's what I think I am. And my interest in cannabis goes back a long time, about 20-ish years. And very, very briefly, I'm not going to go into my life history, so don't panic. But I was involved in multiple sclerosis in Newcastle, where I live, and people were coming to the clinic saying that they used cannabis 20 odd years ago. This is for pain and spasticity, muscle spasm. And I just asked them, and I found about 50% of the people coming to that clinic were using cannabis. So I thought these were often mainly quite severely disabled people who were criminalizing themselves, risking getting cannabis from whatever source. And I thought if they're doing this and it's making a difference to the extent that they're carrying on doing this, there must be something in this, and there must be something to cannabis that I, at that point, knew nothing about. So I was then asked by chance by GW Pharma to help them with the development of what turned out to be the first ever licensed cannabis medicine called Sativex, which is licensed for drug-resistant spasticity and multiple sclerosis. So I worked with them. And then nothing much happened for about a decade until I was asked to do a report for the thing called the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Drug Policy Reform in Westminster, which I did with my daughter, in fact, called the Barnes Report now. The Barnes' plural report, it should be called. And that covered the efficacy of cannabis across the spectrum. And that thrust me a bit into the limelight, because there's a good way to get into the limelight is to write something no one else has written, then automatically you're the expert on the subject. So that's how it came about. And soon after that report, I was asked to help Hannah get the first license for her son, Alfie, and she can talk about that in a moment. That was summer 18, almost exactly 3 years ago. Yes, 3 years ago. And that campaign that Hannah fronted was probably one of the most successful media campaigns ever in the country, because it changed the law in the space of about 6 months from the government's position that cannabis is of no value to anybody. It's a drug of addiction. It has no medicinal value and it's unsafe. In the summer 18 to, well, okay, it might have some medical value. We'll make it legal to prescribe by November 18. So it was an extraordinary story, actually. So on the 1st of November 2018, in the UK, the law changed to allow doctors on the specialist register, that's basically hospital consultants, not GPs, to prescribe cannabis. So that's very quick history of where we got to, but what's happened since then? I actually thought the 1st of November 18 was it. That's it, job done, laws changed. I thought, slowly but surely doctors will start prescribing the stuff and moving onwards. 3 years later, or nearly 3 years later, that hasn't happened. There are 3 prescriptions in the whole of the National Health Service in the UK. One for Alfie and 2 other children who've had high media profile, and no adults at all. I'll briefly go over the reason for that in a moment, but that's where we are, 3 prescriptions. So it's all in the private sector, which is sad. Nothing wrong with the private sector, but nevertheless, for many of the patients, even though the cost in the private sector has reduced quite significantly by at least 50% over the last couple of years, it's still out of reach of many people. Unless you're on a program called T21, which I might come to in a moment. You're looking for ordinary prescription, if there's such a thing, of about £500 a month. So that's a lot of money for a lot of people. And for children who ironically need much more dosage than adults, you're still looking at between about 1,500 up to £2,000 a month privately, which is, disgraceful considering the laws changed. But that's where we are. Now in the UK, there is about 10 clinics, cannabis clinics. Now, you don't have to prescribe through a cannabis clinic. Any doctor on the specialist register can just write a cannabis prescription. And there's a handful of doctors who are doing that out of their own private rooms, wherever. But most do prescribe through a cannabis clinic. The advantage of a cannabis clinic is clear that you get support from colleagues. And cannabis medicine is a little bit different from ordinary. It's not like a new antihypertensive. It's not like a new anti-diabetic drug, a new antibiotic. You get 10 minutes from the drug rep and off you go prescribing it. It's a different, almost an art form. I don't want to overdo it, but there's a lot to cannabis medicine that doctors aren't used to. And so working in it from a cannabis clinic where you've got the support from colleagues, and that peer support and the approval of the prescriptions is probably the best way to do it. So I personally think it's best to prescribe out of a cannabis orientated clinic. Doesn't have to be just cannabis. There's a couple of pain clinics, for example, that now prescribe cannabis in the context of other treatments for pain. The numbers prescribed now are about 6,000, I just said earlier, patients. So that you might think that's a lot, but actually in the UK, there's meant to be, and a study, a YouGov survey was about 2 years ago, showed there's about 1.4 million people in the UK using illegal cannabis every day for medical purposes, not recreational. That's about 3 million, but about 1.4 million. You add to that number those who would benefit from cannabis but don't want to criminalize themselves, and that's an unknown quantity, but I think conservatively that means there's between 2.5, maybe even up to 3 million. And the accepted number, looking at the experience in the American states and Canada and Australia, is you're probably looking at between 2 and 3% of the population who would benefit from medicinal cannabis. So the fact we've got 6,000 prescriptions still leaves 1.994 million left to go. So you can work out very roughly from Guernsey population, 2 to 3% is roughly the number of people on Guernsey who would benefit from the medicine, broadly speaking. Out of about 10 clinics, we've now trained I've trained about 150 doctors. Of those, about 60 are now prescribing. More will come aboard. It takes 2 or 3 months in the UK for doctors to get their prescription charts and the bureaucracy sorted. But some, in fairness, just wanted to be trained through interest, so they can say to their patients, this is a good medicine for you or not. So I'm very happy to teach doctors or any other health professional who just wants to know about cannabis and doesn't want to prescribe it. I think that's really important, actually. But at the moment, we have, I think the exact number is 61 prescribing doctors across a whole range of specialties. Our experience is interesting in that 60%, it's easy to remember this if I test you afterwards, it's all 60%. So there's 6,000 patients, 60 doctors, not 60 clinics, that's an exception to that. But 60% of the prescriptions are for pain, chronic pain. The rest, about 20% or so, are for psychiatric conditions like anxiety and PTSD. And the remaining 20% or so is a whole mishmash of other conditions, mainly neurological, like multiple sclerosis. And epilepsy, of course, both adults and children. And then it's also becoming useful or more recognized now for gastrointestinal disorders, such as Crohn's, inflammatory bowel disease, ulcerative colitis, and of course for cancer. And I'm not going to sit here saying that cannabis is a cure-all for cancer, because it almost certainly is not. It may have good anti-cancer effects for some types of cancer, particularly a form of brain cancer, glioblastoma, some types of breast cancer. But the main role in cancer, I think, at the moment at least, is for symptom control. So if I had advanced cancer, I would certainly use it because it helps pain, which can be an issue in terminal cancer. It helps spasticity, which can be an issue. It helps epilepsy, which can be an issue. But more particularly, it helps sleep, which is certainly an issue, and appetite, which can clearly go off in end-stage cancer as well. And so there's a lot, and anxiety, obviously. So for about 7 or 8% of the clinics are cancer for symptom control and improve quality of life. So that's roughly what it's now being used for in the UK. And of course, you'll have roughly the same proportion of people on Guernsey with those same sort of conditions, I would suggest. Okay, what are the problems we've had? Well, supply chain has been an issue. There's now about 16 licensed producers who have product in the UK. And they've all got the usual sort of range of product from high CBD, balanced high THC oils and flour. There's about something like 75 products in the UK now, which is a decent number, but the issues we've had are mainly supply chain issues. Post Brexit, there have been supply chain issues from Europe, which you might have read about. There's been COVID issues, which is hopefully a one-off. But the supply chain has been very higgledy-piggledy. It's been on and off, which is not a good thing for people who need medicine every day, particularly those with epilepsy. You do need a secure supply chain. So what I'd love to see is a UK-wide, and if you'll forgive me, I include the Channel Islands and the Isle of Man in the UK-wide. I shouldn't do that, apologies. But I think the Channel Islands, Isle of Man and the UK does need its own industry, either growing and or extracting, because that would help secure the supply chain. And I think that would be a really useful, and also for the economies of those countries. Maple Tree, which I'll come to in a second, produced a paper recently, which made the point that you create a UK-wide industry, you can create about 100,000 jobs, and it's a multi-billion industry, raising probably something like 300 million in revenue for the government, which is better in the, dare I say it, better in the government's hands than the criminal hands. So there's a good case for a homegrown industry. So very briefly, I was asked to talk for about 20 minutes. I won't overstay my welcome, but why are there not more prescription? This may be relevant to Guernsey. And one reason is ignorance of the medical profession. And I don't mean that hugely rudely to the medical profession, but a little bit rudely, that there's a lot of ignorance about how to prescribe cannabis medicine and what to do. How do you prescribe a flower, for example? And that's the other 60%. Honey was another 60%. 60% of prescriptions are for flour and 40% for oil. And doctors don't really know how to prescribe flour, and they need training. So we desperately need to set up training programs, which we have done through something called the Academy of Medical Cannabis, and now through the Medical Cannabis Clinicians Society, which Hannah runs, and I chair at the moment. That's got about 200 members, doctor members, and we set up a training program through that. That helps. We've got poor guidelines in the UK. NICE, which I'm sure you're familiar with, produced some really awful guidelines because they looked at cannabis as a pharmaceutical product and not as a botanical product, and tried to force it down a pharmaceutical paradigm, and it doesn't frankly fit. So NICE guidelines and other guidelines from bodies like the British Pediatric Neurology Association have been pretty useless, dare I say, which doesn't help the situation. Guidelines are guidelines, but in many cases like NICE, they're rather mandatory, to be quite honest. And others think there's a lack of evidence of the usefulness of cannabis, which I fundamentally disagree with. And my last point is that if you look at cannabis as a pharmaceutical product, I accept that there are not many, there are some, but not many double-blind, placebo-controlled studies as you do with a single molecule pharmaceutical product. Nothing wrong with that. But cannabis is not a single molecule pharmaceutical product. It's a botanical product with 147 cannabinoids and 100 terpenes and 100 flavonoids, all in a mix, and you can't do a double-blind placebo-controlled study on that. You have to do real-world evidence, looking at observational data, N of 1 data, case studies, and look at that. Totality of that evidence is really quite compelling for cannabis. Not quite compelling, it's overwhelmingly compelling for pain and anxiety and epilepsy, is to name but three. And I think the bodies need to really look at the real world evidence for cannabis efficacy, as we are now with COVID vaccinations. All of a sudden, real world evidence is in fashion because of COVID and the injection, the vaccination program. So that's all fine for COVID in vaccinations, but it's not apparently fine for cannabis. So we do need to look more differently at the evidence base for cannabis as a medicine. And if you do that, I think you'll find the evidence is really quite overwhelming. So that's where we are in terms of the clinics, Medical Cannabis Clinician Society, and finally, I think this is the third finally I've said, so this is finally. Just a brief mention of the Cannabis Industry Council. We wanted cannabis to speak with one voice. which it wasn't doing. So I set up the Cannabis Industry Council only about a month ago. It's now got over 100 members, including 4C Labs. Thank you. And hope that's all the clinics, dispensaries, producers, parliamentary bodies, patient groups, hemp bodies, but not the individual hemp companies, etc. And its first face-to-face meeting is next week. And I hope that will help the industry across the whole of the UK, Channel Islands and Isle of Man, to coordinate itself and improve the standards and get a better functioning, decent, ethical, profitable industry. And that is a quick summary of where we are over the last 3 years. Thank you very much. I'll pass over to my colleague Hannah, who works with me on Mapletree, which I've managed to say nothing at all about, haven't I?
Well, I'll mention it, Mike.
Okay,
Thanks, Mike.
That's good. Thank you.